Welcome back to the Earth-like planet of Noterra. The fragile little planet is once again deep in the throes of a global ice age, brought about by the very fuel of life, oxygen. This episode is a special episode dedicated to this ceaseless winter season. For most, the ice and snow are heralds of death and destruction, but a few species even preferred to call this cold-stricken waste their home. Today, we'll take a look at the species that not only survived the glaciation, but thrived in its frigid embrace. Our story begins quite a little while ago, 20 million years before the Great Glaciation gripped the world. It was a very different time indeed, one of the warmest in Noterra's recent history. It was so warm, in fact, that the planet had no ice caps to speak of. Instead, there were open oceans at the planet's poles, albeit dotted with icebergs and snow-covered volcanic islands. It's here that we would find a group of photosynthetic Criteriotes on its last legs, the polaridians. Thriving in cold polar waters and under thin sheets of ice, they were, in many ways, a very atypical lineage. They partnered themselves up with a photoform symbiont, now turned organelle, that specialized in under-ice photosynthesis. Ice blocks redder wavelengths of light, so these photoforms possessed pigments that biased them towards photosynthesizing bluer light. This fact is also responsible for the polaridians' distinguishing yellow-orange appearance. In cold conditions, cellular structures become brittle, and it pays off to live slowly and carefully. Polaridians were no exception. The energetically expensive periplasm was substantially reduced in this clade to only a thin layer between two nearly conjoined membranes. A unique series of gated channels ran directly through both, which drastically lowered the metabolic cost of transporting molecules over two separate membranes. Living in icy waters, they had a few tricks to avoid turning into ice crystals themselves. Polaridian membranes were packed with unsaturated fatty acids to keep them fluid, and their cytoplasm was filled with a family of antifreeze proteins and polymers that prevented the formation of ice within the cell. They lived as motile swimmers, constantly repositioning themselves to catch cracks where light penetrated the ice. But alas, the polar sun has a tendency to disappear for months at a time. That spelled disaster for a species that starved in darkness, and so the polaridians evolved to spend the winter in dormancy. As the days got shorter and the light got redder, the polaridians would begin to pump out water and dehydrate themselves to the best of their ability. Their metabolisms would slow down, gene transcription would stop, and special proteins would encase their cell membranes to hold them in place. What remained was a cyst, a sleeping cell waiting for the new dawn. These wonderfully unique creatures were struggling in the warm world of their time, but the coming ice age would soon reverse their fortunes. To see where they were headed, let's skip ahead roughly 70 million years to a world frozen beyond recognition. This world was too cold even for most of the old polaridians, some of which were still holding on only wherever the ice sheets were thin enough and the waters sufficiently mild. The surface was windswept and blanketed by snow, even here at the equator. And yet, the icy wastes were not as barren as they may first have appeared. Around rocks or grains of sand, a brown ooze stained the fresh snow. Easily mistaken for some form of pollution, this was in fact the product of life. It's here that we meet the distant descendants of the polaridians, Ukalida temporis, part of the Ukalid family. Atmospheric temperatures in this environment swung between 3 degrees during the day and minus 10 degrees during the night. But being embedded in insulating snow, our single-celled survivalists only experienced a relatively stable range of 1 to minus 4 degrees. These temperatures were high enough that microscopic channels of meltwater would be an almost constant presence between particles of snow, particularly during the day. Rocks put pressure on the snow and created small films of liquid water under them. This was where Ukalida temporis made its home. Aside from preventing freezing from within, cells in icy environments must contend with the contagious nature of ice, which spreads quickly and can disrupt life from the outside. Eucalids possessed a thick and spongy cell wall made of polysaccharides which prevented the membrane from bursting even when threatened by piercing ice crystals. However, merely surviving the ice is not as useful as being able to go on the offensive. What made Eucalids so uniquely successful is that they had evolved a special family of chemicals called thermopigments. These were non-photosynthetic pigments which absorbed light and converted it almost entirely into heat at ultra-high efficiencies. In this family, there were two such pigments, chaladonin and thermionin. Chaladonin absorbed a wide range of UV wavelengths and a small chunk of high-wavelength blue light, while thermionin captured reds and infrareds. Chaladonin also served a secondary function to protect against UV damage, and the remaining light was mostly used up by photosynthesis. These thermopigments were embedded in the Euclid's cell wall and were collectively responsible for its brown appearance. Beneath that cell wall, a layer of polymerized gel had evolved to saturate the periplasm and insulated the cell, ensuring that heat was directed outwards. When exposed to the equatorial sun, Euclids would heat the surrounding water and cause a small, barely noticeable retreat of the ice. A single cell could do little to meaningfully affect temperatures, but together colonies of Euclids could substantially heat up and push ice, which was close to melting, fully over the edge. To support them in this endeavor and to make their gains against the ice last, Ukalida temporis excreted an extracellular matrix of antifreeze polymers into its environment, preventing water from refreezing even when temperatures dropped. In this way, Ukalida temporis was responsible for engineering its own microenvironment, and was obligately colonial. A single cell could not survive anything but the most favorable conditions. As a group, they could maintain substantial liquid water even as temperatures dropped below freezing. Euclids, in general, had three possible forms: a vegetative form used for growth and reproduction, a motile form used to colonize new habitats and scavenge for resources, and a cyst-like form used to survive harsh periods and disasters. Ukalida temporis was a shining example of all three. It spent the majority of its life in its colonial vegetative form, photosynthesizing and reproducing asexually. In the event of prolonged cold, or if it found itself buried deep under the snow, it would undergo encystment. Euclids went into a deeper, more resilient dormancy than their basal polaridian ancestors, replacing most of the water in their cytoplasm with a gel-like alternative that was immune to freezing. In this form, they could survive temperatures as low as -12 degrees. Finally, when conditions were either very warm or nutrients became too scarce to sustain the colony, chunks of the colony would become motile together. They would make their way through the meltwater corridors, searching for nutrient-rich dust or optimal light conditions before settling back down together in their new home. During these migrations, temporis would shed most of its cell wall in order to facilitate nucleocyst exchange while the hopeful colony was on the move. This was the recipe with which Ukalida temporis had conquered the snowy plains of the equator, but it didn't have the luxury of being their sole colonist. Stalking among the same meltwater channels that housed Ukalida temporis, another Euclid, Ukalida cystophagus, was searching for a meal. They were summer scavengers, looking for cysts that had either frozen or failed to revive themselves after a cold winter. Their expanded periplasm allowed them to store a number of consumed cysts at once as they scoured the meltwater corridors in a flagellated motile form. In adapting for their new lifestyle, they had given up some of the traits that defined Euclids. For one, they made sparing use of thermopigments, losing the ability to produce thermionin entirely. They did produce chaladonin, which they stored in their periplasm for UV protection, but it had long lost its role in thermoregulation. Secondly, they produced no external polymer matrices of any kind, being solitary hunters not particularly interested in environmental engineering. The cell wall, ancestral to Euclids, would only get in the way of phagocytosis, meaning it was highly reduced in the cystophage's motile form. Two mechanoreceptive antennae emerging from its front helped the cystophage navigate towards food and allowed it to avoid bumping into ice. Only in their vegetative, or in this case digestive form, did the cell wall become reinforced to prevent damage from freezing. The cytophage would enter this state after a brief window of motile activity at the beginning of the summer season. Over the remainder of the summer, it would slowly digest its scavenged cysts, while simultaneously gradually encystifying itself as the winter cold set in. While cystophages were primarily heterotrophic, they retained some photosynthetic organelles and could survive summers with poor yields, for example those after particularly mild winters. So far, the Euclids we've looked at have been confined to freshwater environments, but something interesting tends to happen when saltwater becomes frozen. Ice cannot hold salt effectively, so as salt water freezes, salt is pushed out into the surrounding water, creating pockets of water so salty that it cannot freeze even at very low temperatures. These are called brine channels, and would create a suitable microhabitat for any microbe adapted enough to withstand the salinity. Living in brine channels up to 10 centimeters below the surface, we would find the last eucalypt species we'll explore today, Ukalida crystallis. In many ways, this species was quite similar to its snow-dwelling relatives. It relied on thermopigments and extracellular matrices to deal with the instability of temperatures and salinity so close to the surface. Unlike Temperus, crystallis produced barely any thermionin, since, as we mentioned earlier, redder light is blocked by ice. But this species was further adapted to overcome the intense salinity and strange conditions of its environment. Crystallis required tight osmotic regulation and strong ion channels that could pump out toxic levels of salt faster than they could accumulate. The cell wall was also thicker and packed with acidic polysaccharides that temporarily bonded with sodium ions, creating a chemical buffer from the oppressive salinity. Nutrients can appear in very high concentrations in brine channels, as these are similarly excluded by the ice, so Ukalida crystallis was an excellent osmotroph. The extracellular polymer matrix it excreted had a secondary function as a kind of net to bind nutrients dissolved in the water, making it easier for the colony to survive periods of nutrient drought. Together, the eucalyds were easily the rulers of Noterra's surface during this deadly period of its history. And yet, it would be naive to overlook the other species that in some ways completely outclassed them. Tens of meters beneath the ice, a depth at which the moods of the surface weather become irrelevant tantrums, a species called Vathizoa altus occupied the brine channels in the deep of the polar north. Vathizoa was a far divergent sister clade of the eucalyds and had convergently evolved to withstand the ruthless ice. Vathizoa altus lived regimented, stable existences, completely intolerant of change or fluctuation, only enabled by the highly stable, isolated brine channels so deep underneath this ice. The salinity down here was nothing less than extreme, and temperatures rarely exceeded minus 10 degrees Celsius. Light at this depth was so sparse and so shifted towards blue that the otherwise orange-yellow Vathizoans appeared almost black. Their photosynthetic organelles had adapted pigments that could photosynthesize off certain wavelengths of UV light, as well as most blue light, in response. Being a polar life form where light shines for only half the year, Vathizoa altus was deeply seasonal, much like its polaridian ancestors. Completely lacking the ability to grow flagella, they spent most of their lives in a vegetative form, growing and reproducing extremely slowly. For the most part, this reproduction consisted of asexual cloning. Only in the rare event when two unrelated individuals became physically attached to one another would nucleocysts be exchanged. Proteins on the cell's surfaces would let individuals gauge each other's relatedness. Vathizoa altus stabilized itself by attaching to ice surfaces using a unique matrix layer, which we'll now take a closer look at. The matrix was the largest part of the cell's exterior. While composed mostly of adhesive proteins, it also served to absorb stress during periods of expanding ice. This feature is one of the main ways Vathizoans can be distinguished from eucalyds, as the matrix which sits outside the cell in Vathizoans is homologous to the matrix that sits under the cell in eucalyds. The cell wall itself in Vathizoans was thick but flexible, made of a distinguishing material called vathyrin, which in many ways resembled Earth's collagen. The only living relative of Vathizoa altus, and the last species we'll look at today, was a small biological marvel. Every environment we've seen so far has been balmy in comparison to the preferred home of the most extreme survivalist Noterra had thus yet evolved. Vathizoa cryotis was found near volcanic hotspots, where temperatures ranged between minus 10 and minus 20 degrees Celsius, and the only liquid water was a brief luxury in times of sparse geothermal heating. Unlike the majority of Noterra's life, which took refuge in warm volcanic pools, cryotis lived on the margins of the volcanic zone, in ponds like this, where ice was the rule and melting was the rare exception. Vathizoa cryotis was photosynthetic, superficially resembling its long-lost ancestors, except that it lived its life almost permanently encysted in one of the most radical biochemical stases imaginable. When encysted, cryotis became practically entirely dehydrated. Its cytoplasm was replaced with a solid polymerized substance, and its metabolism ground to a complete halt. This polymerized substance, called the cryomer complex, can be thought of as a biologically friendly form of ice, which, unlike ice crystals, preserved the structure of proteins and lipids and did not exclude molecules like salt. The cryomer complex did not stop at the cell membrane. Cryotis was also encased in a large extracellular matrix that held external cryomers in place between the cell and the surrounding ice. All in all, the extraordinary encysted form of Vathizoa cryotis more resembled a microscopic marble than it did a living cell. In the rare window of opportunity, when geothermal heating from below melted away the ice or snow on the surface, these frozen marbles would reawaken. The cryomers would melt and rehydrate the cell, and with all cellular components still in place, the cell would begin to metabolize again in a matter of minutes, the fastest revival of any Cretaceous species. Once revived, soot deposited by volcanic activity seeped enough nutrients into the water to fuel rapid asexual reproduction. Cryotis bloomed in short month-long windows while the warmth lasted in these highly episodic volcanic grounds. They used a long singular flagellum to swim around these warm local pools, staying close to the sunlit surface. Their temporary geothermal puddles could become so overpopulated that the water would be stained yellow, and competition between individuals would become too intense to bear. It was at that point that Cryotis typically began to seek new habitats, burrowing itself through any meltwater channels in the ice as far away from the central pond as possible. Over time, this was how the species conquered new territory. But when the volcanic warmth once again faded, the bloom would be frozen in place as Cryotis remarbleized, leaving behind an unassuming patch of ice and snow waiting for another chance at life. Most patches would never get it. For these 5 species, extraordinarily cold-loving life forms, the glaciation was a cradle and a blessing. While the rest of life struggled and starved, the Euclids and Vathizoans were in their prime. The Hadriatic glaciation would last 250 million years altogether, and as the ice receded slowly over the last few tens of millions of years, so did these incredible life forms. For most of them, it merely meant a reduction of their habitat back to their homeland in the polar regions. But for specialists like the Vathizoans, the glaciation was the only time and place with conditions extreme enough for their survival. Both Vathizoan lineages would not survive the end of the Hadriatic glaciation. But some stories have to end to make room for new ones, and the world emerging out of this ceaseless winter was ripe with opportunity. I will see you all in another 100 million years.